Welcome to our lecture for for module 7.1. For this particular module, we're going to take a look at the state of education in Georgia, primarily, of course, pre-K through 12, but we'll also take a look at um, some of the implications that has for higher education as well. So just in terms of the state of Georgia, um, the state of Georgia has over 1.7 million students who attend schools. Well over 700,000 students in elementary school, over 400,000 students in middle school, and over 500,000 students who attend high schools. And you can see the percentages that make up those totals right next to each figure. Now, in terms of breakdowns, uh, in terms of race and ethnicity, um, almost 40% of students who attend schools in Georgia are white. Over 35% of students are black. Got about 16% of students who are Hispanic, 4% of students who are Asian, and 4% of students who are other. In terms of gender, there's almost an even split, 51% male, 49% female. Now, other student facts involve other demographic groups. One of the most striking features of the population of students who attend schools in Georgia is the percentage of students who receive free and reduced lunch. So we think about free and reduced lunch. Really, what we're talking about are the number of students in the state of Georgia who technically live below the poverty line. So that's 60%. So more than half of the students in the state of Georgia are considered students who live or are from families that are below the poverty line. In terms of students with disabilities who receive special education services, a little over 11%. Um, English language learners or limited English proficiency, just under 10% at 8.2%. Students who receive transportation services, that's over a million students. And again, Georgia is a state that doesn't have a lot of public transportation throughout the state like some other states, particularly in the north and also in the west. And about 3.3 students attend Georgia virtual schools. Now, as I went through those, I read the percentages, but you can see the actual numbers next to those percentages. Okay, so basically, I've just broken those figures down in two different ways. In this slide, I've got them all on one window within the slide. We've got the number of public school students. We've got it broken down by elementary, middle, and high school. We have students broken down by race and ethnicity. We've got the gender percentages and also those students who receive special services. Okay, let's take a look at the teaching workforce in the state of Georgia. Georgia has just under 120,000 teachers that teach at its public schools. In terms of race and ethnicity, you see the figures there. Um, the largest percentage of teachers in the state of Georgia are white, almost 70%. But one of the surprising things about Georgia is that the number of, or the percentage of black students, black teachers, I'm sorry, um, is about double what the national average is. So in the state of Georgia, 26% of teachers in this state are black or African American. And I think that speaks to the demographic changes that we've seen within the state of Georgia as well. Um, there are 2.6% Hispanic or Latinx teachers, 1.3% Asian teachers, 0.2% Native American teachers, and multiracial or other, we've got 1.7%. Now, of course, the gender breakdown pretty much matches or is very similar to the national average. Almost 80% of the teachers in the state of Georgia are female. and of course, 20% are male. And again, uh, the field of education, particularly in K through 12 education, um, teaching positions are largely filled by women, and that's a long-standing tradition that we have in the United States, and Georgia is very much in keeping with that tradition. Okay. Other breakdowns: teacher experience. Okay. Um, I've got a little over 5% of teachers with less than a year of experience. Um, about a third of teachers in the state of Georgia have a year to 10 years of experience. Another third have 11 to 20 years of experience. Then we start to see a little bit of a drop off when we get to over 20 years of experience. About 20% of teachers with 21 to 30 years of experience. And once you get to that magic number of 30, those long timers who've been doing this for a long time, it starts to drop down to about 3.6%, which makes sense because, the further along that you go into your career, um, people reach retirement age, and some people opt to retire early. And I think that some of the challenges and tribulations that teachers face during the COVID-19 crisis has encouraged more teachers to go on ahead and take their retirement. Okay, in terms of teacher preparation, um, 37.5% have bachelor's degrees, over 40% have master's degrees, almost 20% have specialist degrees, and 2.6% have doctoral degrees. And then we've got under 1% that have some other form of preparation. Um, Now, an interesting statistic to look at are the leadership positions that are filled by race and ethnicity. And when we talk about leadership, of course, we're talking about principals, assistant principals, deans, and things like that. And we don't often think about leadership and what the implications of that are. So 60% of the leadership positions are filled by white teachers. Um, Black teachers come in at surprisingly 36%. So over one third of the leadership positions in education in the state of Georgia are filled by Black leaders. And then, of course, we have leaders that represent the other groups. Um, but it's just so important for us to have a diverse teaching force, but also a diverse leadership force. So these are things that you all need to be aware of and that you need to think about as you move through your educational career, because these factors have implications for our students' outcomes, school experiences as well. Okay. Um, an interesting statistic to look at are the percentages of teachers by race and ethnicity who teach at high poverty schools, or, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, Title I schools. Okay, the thing that's really striking to me is that over 40% of the teachers who teach in high poverty schools are Black or African American. Um, and later on in the lecture, we'll look at the racial breakdown or the racial makeup of students in terms of poverty. Um, so as we've discussed in the course, there are strong correlations between race and poverty in the United States, which um, really has a lot to do with our history of structural racism, and how it has served to dampen the economic prospects and opportunities of African Americans. So we have a lot of Black students who attend uh, high poverty or Title I schools, but we also have lots of Black teachers who teach at high poverty schools. Now, in fairness, over 50% of the teachers who work in high poverty schools are white, but we're a lot closer to parity in high poverty schools than we are in low poverty schools. That's interesting. Almost 80% of the teachers in low poverty schools are white. Less than 15% um, are Black. And then we see some of the other racial and ethnic groups, and the percentages that teach in low poverty schools. Okay. Now, another factor that we have to look at is how does Georgia stack up or how does it rank when compared to other states in terms of the quality of the education students receive? And just generally speaking, Georgia traditionally ranks in the bottom half of 50 states in terms of the overall quality of its public educational system. Now, according to US News, Georgia ranks 30th in overall quality of pre-K through 12 public education. And these are some of the figures that they use to um, tabulate this ranking in US News. They use college readiness, high school graduation rates, National Assessment of Educational Progress, math and reading scores, and also preschool enrollment. And you can see the figures there for yourself. But I think that preschool enrollment number is pretty encouraging. So Georgia ranks 13th in terms of the numbers of students who are enrolled in preschool. And preschool, high quality preschool is a very, very important educational indicator because when students have high quality preschool experiences, they generally tend to do better academically um, as they move into elementary school. Okay. In terms of Wallet Hub, Georgia's 34th overall in pre-K through 12 education, 37th in quality, 36th in safety. Um, Wallet Hub, of course, they're a financial institution, but you'll find that financial institutions have a major stake in evaluating the quality of educational systems in states because there's a correlation between the quality of education within a state and also economic development and socioeconomic well-being. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move through the lecture. But in terms of quality, they rank quality based on test scores, high school graduation rates, dropout rates, teacher-student ratios, and also the number of schools in the top 700 public schools list that are within that state. Safety measures include factors like COVID school closures, uh, access, digital learning and access when students are out of school, access to illegal drugs, school shootings, violence, and also youth incarceration rates. Okay. Third metric that I looked at in preparation for this lecture was the data from Education Week. Education Week uses the following metrics to come up with its ranking. And Education Week is a little bit different because they actually give schools a letter grade similar to what your college professors give you for your assignments and for your overall performance within a particular semester. Education Week uses student achievement, student potential for success, school finances, state assessments and standards, and teacher and school accountability to make its ranking. And according to its ranking, Education Week came up with the following grades. In terms of overall achievement, Georgia gets a C minus. Um, Current status of the quality of its overall education system is a D plus. In terms of change over time, in other words, change and improvement, C plus. And in terms of equity, Georgia gets a B minus. So that equity grade basically says that compared to other states, Georgia seems to be doing a fairly good job of providing students from marginalized backgrounds with the services and the funds that they need to catch up and to grow. So state education rankings are important. And one reason is because education is necessary for economic mobility. Um, and people, it's just generally speaking, the better educated you are, the more education that you have, you improve the likelihood that over time and over the span of your life, you will be able to make more money. Okay. Um, the quality of education within a state also indicates the state's commitment to educational equity. Okay, educational equity is important. It goes beyond equality. Equality proposes that we just give everybody the same thing. Educational equity maintains that students should be given what they need to perform at an acceptable level. Um, and that it's really not acceptable to just give everybody the same thing because not everybody starts with the same advantages. Um, Lack of equity contributes to structural inequality as well. Without equity, kids who are from marginalized backgrounds, they won't have an opportunity to do as well as students who are wealthy and whose families have resources and access to the kinds of services and supports um, that students need to develop, cognitively and develop in terms of their skill levels. Um, and some of the discrepancies that we see in the quality of education between states um, have to do with factors like differences in the strengths of state economies, the amounts of funding that states dedicate to education, and the dearth or the lack of specialized programs to meet the needs of students from marginalized groups. So again, the quality of a state's educational system is intimately tied up with the state's economic health, and that's why these issues are important and are often addressed by financial institutions. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about um, the percentage of students in Georgia who live below the poverty line. And again, 60% of kids in Georgia live below the poverty line. So that means if you were to just take 10 kids and line them up, just generally speaking, six of those 10 children would come from low income backgrounds. Okay, so on this slide, we've got it broken down. Um, into age ranges under six, about 27%. Kids who are ages 6 to 11 um, come in at almost 25%. And adolescents 12 to 17 years old in Georgia have a poverty rate of just a little over 20%. So poverty is a significant issue and a significant challenge um, in the state of Georgia. And that has impact on the quality of education students receive. It has an impact on the kinds of programs that we need to offer as well. Okay, so when we talk about students who live below the poverty line, um, we also have to talk about Title I schools. Okay, and I know that we throw that term around a lot, but I felt like it would be worthwhile um, for us to talk a little bit about what Title I schools are. Title I is a federal government program, and what it does is it disburses funds through the Georgia Department of Education to provide specialized educational services for students who come from low income backgrounds and who will need the additional support. Okay, this money goes to schools that have high concentrations of kids in poverty. And the money is designed to help all students meet state academic content standards and student achievement standards. Now, one of the interesting things about Title I is there are actually two types. There's school-wide Title I funding, and that's a situation when pretty much every student in the school is entitled to services and receives those specialized services. Um, then there's targeted assistance, and that's services that are designed for select groups of students within a particular school. And in the state of Georgia, there are over 1,600 Title I schools. Okay, so in this course, one of the things that we've talked about is we've talked about the school to prison pipeline, and we've talked about zero tolerance policy. So I figured that in examining the state of education in Georgia, we needed to look at some of these statistics as well. And they're pretty stark. On this slide, we've got in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions just by numbers. And didn't break them down by percentages, but the numbers are absolutely striking. And on both lists, if you see the number of Black students who are either subjected to in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension, it's significantly high. In terms of in-school suspension, almost 100,000 kids. In terms of out-of-school suspension, almost 85,000 Black children have been subjected to out of school suspension. And you see the other numbers. Um, White students, about 50,000 for in school suspension. Um, see, Hispanic Latinx students, almost 20,000, multiracial students, over 5,000, Native American students, 261, and Asian Pacific Islanders, over 1,500. And that's in school suspension. Now, in terms of out of school suspension, again, we talked about almost 85,000 Black students, about 25,000 white students, Hispanic Latinx, a little over 10,000. And then we see the numbers for the other groups. But if there isn't a number that affirms or confirms what we've been talking about the kinds of discriminatory disciplinary practices that we see used in Georgia schools and really across the nation, frankly, but specifically in Georgia, these numbers right here on this particular slide should serve as a wake-up call. Okay, in terms of expulsions, we've got some pretty stark numbers here. Okay. Um, and when kids are expelled, that means they're just put out of school. Um, Black students, over 4,000 students were expelled within a year. That's 67 out of 10,000. Hispanic students, 23. I'm sorry, 595, which accounts to 23 per every 10,000. Um, let's see, Native Americans 18, which accounts for 51 per every 10,000. White students a little over 2,000, so about 30 out of every 10,000. Then we've got multiracial and Asian Pacific Island students. Asian Pacific Island students, 51, 7 per 10,000. Multiracial students, 243, 41 per every 10,000. But if we just look at the numbers, the actual, just the straight number of students who were expelled, and also look at the number per 10,000. Again, we see um, that same pattern of inequity repeating itself in terms of exclusionary discipline. Okay. Furthering our dive into the state of education in Georgia, um, what we want to do now is take a look at academic performance. Okay, and this is of course, the NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is basically serves as the nation's the test that forms the nation's report card in terms of understanding how well students in our schools are doing. Okay, these are total composites for students just across the board. We see where they are in terms of the percentages who are above, at or above proficient, and the percentages that are at or above basic. So generally, in most areas, just across the board, there's about a third of students who are at or above proficient, and then 2/3 to 75% of students who score at or above basic. And this is in fourth grade and in eighth grade, math, reading, and science. Okay. Now, what we also have to do is we also have to take a look at how students do based on race and ethnicity. Again, we still have to continue to tease out those factors of race and ethnicity. Okay. For fourth grade reading, 63% of all students are at or above basic, 32% are at or above proficient. If we start looking at those numbers, um, they're pretty striking. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is there's an achievement gap that we don't often talk about. And really just the whole idea of the achievement gap is actually a fallacy, because really it's not about student achievement, it's about students opportunities to learn. But since people are comfortable and used to using the achievement gap rhetoric, we'll take a look at it here. um, One achievement gap that we don't pay much attention to is the achievement gap between Asian and white students. Pretty much when just across the board, when we look at academic achievement, Asian students pretty much outperform everybody. And I always find it very curious that we immediately jump to the black, white, or the black and Latinx achievement gaps. But we never take time to look at the fact that, Asian kids pretty much outperform everybody. And that's borne out on this list. So if you look at the fourth grade and eighth grade reading scores, whether it's at basic, at or above basic, or at or above proficient, Asian students are the top performers on both sides for both the fourth and eighth grade. Okay, then you see the other numbers. It's tough to look at this data because if we're not careful, we can use it to feed into a deficit perspective on students and their capabilities. But we have to look at the data because it's necessary to help us see um, these gaps and these inequities in students' experiences, opportunities to learn, the kinds of teaching they receive, the kinds of learning experiences they have, um, the kinds of classroom management practices that teachers use with students, and instructional practices. All of these things weigh heavily in terms of how students perform. Okay, we see similar patterns with math. Pretty much the rankings are the same, but I do just have to draw your attention to a couple of things. I mean, Asian students, 97% are at or above basic in fourth grade math, and 93% are at or above basic in eighth grade um, math. 62% at or above proficient in fourth grade, 77% at or above proficient in the eighth grade. Okay, and that kind of highlights some of the contradictions because technically Asian students are students of color. Okay, but they're students of color who traditionally perform extremely well in comparison to everybody else. Okay, again, we can see the other numbers, and we can see some pretty stark discrepancies in terms of performance. I think what's really striking for me uh, are the proficiency levels for um, Black students, of course, on this slide in math, and under 20% of Black students score at or above proficient in math in fourth and eighth grade here in the state of Georgia. There are several factors that feed into that. But I personally think, just based upon my personal experience and research, I think a lot of it has to do with how we teach math. And math is an area that desperately needs practitioners who understand culturally responsive teaching. If we had more culturally responsive educators teaching math, I truly believe that Black students would perform better. Okay. Um, Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we also, on these pages, on this previous slide and on this slide, we have figures for students who receive free and reduced lunch, students with disabilities, and also English language learners. So please make sure that you take note of those statistics as well. Okay. Another thing that we have to look at high school graduation rates by demographic groups. Most recently, Georgia reached over 82% graduation rate for the first time in years. So at 83.8%, almost 85%, people were celebrating that. But when you compare Georgia to other states, that's still um, pretty low. So as a state, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of making sure that we can provide students with the support that they need to finish the job and graduate from high school. And again, for this module, the title and the theme of this module is Teachers as Change Agents. So just throughout this entire module, we've looked at areas where teachers have opportunities to be change agents, implementing those practices that we've been talking about, culturally relevant teaching, restorative classroom management in your classrooms, asset-based instruction, students' funds of knowledge. These are the kinds of things that students from marginalized backgrounds really need in order to improve their academic performance. Okay. If we kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into the stats, 93% of Asian Pacific Islander students graduate, 81% Black, 78% Hispanic. 80% of students are free and reduced lunch, which is a good sign. 70% of students with disabilities, um, and English language learners, 62%. But we can still do better. We can still do better. Okay. I just kind of want to segue and just take a look at college attainment in Georgia. And this is important because, again, this is connected uh, to socioeconomic well being. Okay. 31% of people in the state of Georgia of adults have a BA or above. 39% have at least an associate's. 32% of African Americans have either an AA or a BA degree. 22% of Hispanic Latinx residents have a BA, and 60% of Asian American Pacific Islanders have either an AA or a BA. Okay, now these two charts are very important because I think they highlight the role that education plays in helping you improve your economic circumstances. But they also highlight some of the contradictions that are inherent there as well. Okay. Um, so these are the earnings. The chart on the left takes a look at Georgia median annual earnings by educational attainment for a population 25 years old or older. So if you go down the list, it just clearly shows that the more education you have, um, the more money you make. I mean, it's just that straightforward and that stark. Now, of course, those figures don't necessarily bear out for everybody, but they're averages that we have to look at. Um, People with a graduate degree make over $60,000 on average. Bachelor's degree make around 50 grand. Some college or an associate's degree, it goes down about $15,000. And then you see where folks end up who either have a high school, their high school graduate, or have a GED, or for individuals who have less than a high school education. Okay. Now, the chart on the right is important because it demonstrates that despite education, uh, women still get paid less at all educational levels. Okay, and this is still very important. You can look at the chart and see, that men and women with equivalent levels of education, there are still disparities there, and men still continue to get paid more money. So on the one hand, we're telling people, we encourage people to get an education, but then on the other hand, when we get on the other side of it, we see that um, sexism and gender-based discrimination still plays a role in terms of how much money people make. So we have to be aware of these. And if we're talking about being change agents as teachers and as human beings, we have to be willing to point these things out and actively and openly challenge them. Okay. Um, Now we're taking a look at education, pay, and race. So education raises pay, but Black and Latino Georgians earn less than white Georgians at all educational levels. So again, we're seeing where, just as we talked about, gender discrimination and sexism play a role in salaries. Also, race and racism still continue to play roles as well. So this chart clearly shows that Black and Latino folks who have um, the same or similar levels of education as their white counterparts consistently make less. But what's really interesting is that Asian American Pacific Islanders make more than everybody, you know, based on their level of education. So I don't really even know what to account um, that particular statistic for. But that's interesting, and I think a lot of that has a perception, has to do with perceptions and stereotypes that people have about the intelligence and capabilities um, of Asians. Uh, so combine that with their level of education, and they end up, you know, doing better than other groups. Also, too, I think a lot of what happens with Asians is they have their own businesses a lot of times. Um, so they work together and they support each other too. So that plays a role, and that's a factor as well. Um, so these are all things that we have to look at. But the statistics are pretty stark. You know, the education you receive has implications for your um, socioeconomic well-being, but also factors like gender and race still play a role in these situations. So that's our look at the state of education within the state of Georgia specifically. Hopefully, this has given you a better idea of the big picture of what's happening across the state, how students are doing, what the demographic breakdowns are, how many students we have who attend schools in the state of Georgia, what the teaching force is made of and is comprised of, and also some of those persistent issues and challenges that we see with inequity between groups in terms of academic performance, in terms of disciplinary practices, um, in terms of discrimination in the workplace. So this sums it up, and these are statistics and data that show we've got work to do. We've got work to do. So the expectation is that you will come through this course and you will see these situations and challenges and issues and problems. And you will see yourself as an agent of change who will work within your classroom with your students and with their parents and families to give all of your students the most rigorous and engaging education as possible so that they have the tools that they need to overcome the persistent barriers that continually contribute to inequity in education in the state of Georgia and in the United States.